Hello, friends. Today we're going to unravel a secret. Picture this. A trading floor in New York, 2008. The air is electric, not with triumph, but with panic. Screens flicker red like emergency sirens. Brokers shout, papers scatter, phones ring endlessly, and beneath it all there's a low, steady hum of dread. Something enormous is collapsing, and everyone knows it. Yet behind closed doors, far away from this chaos, a handful of people are smiling. Not because they're blind to the catastrophe, but because this storm was the one they'd been waiting for. For them, every red arrow, every failing bank, every headline about the Great Recession wasn't the end of the world. It was the payday of a lifetime. The 2008 financial crisis has been called many things: a disaster, a betrayal, a failure of the system itself. Millions of people lost their jobs, their homes, their savings, their faith in the future. Families packed up everything they owned into cardboard boxes as banks foreclosed on houses that, just a year before, were sold as dream homes. Small businesses collapsed overnight. Entire towns, especially in America's industrial heartlands, seemed frozen in despair. But while the majority were sinking, a select few were surfing the wave. They didn't just survive, they thrived. They saw it coming, bet against the system, and when the system cracked, they cashed in. And here's where it gets darker. These weren't just lucky gamblers. Some of them had spent years studying obscure mortgage data, poring over loan documents, and connecting dots that no one else wanted to see. Others were institutions powerful enough to play both sides, smiling to their clients while quietly setting up trades that would profit from those very clients' losses. It was a grand theater of deception, courage, and greed. But how do we begin to trace this story? How do we step into a moment in time when the world economy nearly imploded, and at the same time a handful of people made fortunes so vast they're still whispered about today? The best place to start is with the bubble, the inflating balloon of easy money, reckless loans, and blind optimism that finally burst in spectacular fashion. The early 2000s felt like an age of invincibility. Banks and lenders were handing out mortgages like candy at Halloween. It didn't matter if you had a job, or steady income, or even a pulse. If you wanted a house, you got one. No-doc loans, they were called, because you didn't need to provide documentation. Subprime mortgages, sold to people with terrible credit scores, were wrapped up and repackaged as shiny, safe investments. Wall Street loved them. Rating agencies stamped them with gold stars, declaring them almost risk-free. And investors across the globe, from small-town pension funds to sovereign governments, bought them up like they were pure treasure. But behind that glittering facade, the foundations were rotten. Millions of Americans were signing up for mortgages they could never realistically afford. Adjustable-rate loans promised low payments at first, then skyrocketed later. Entire neighborhoods were financed on lies. But the lie was profitable, so it kept growing. Housing prices soared, lenders cheered, construction boomed, and everyone seemed to believe the impossible, that prices would rise forever. Except forever doesn't last long on Wall Street. By 2006, cracks were forming. By 2007, the cracks were widening. Mortgage defaults began to spike. Families who had been promised their piece of the American dream realized the fine print had signed them into nightmares. And by 2008, the balloon didn't just deflate, it exploded. Lehman Brothers collapsed in September, sending shockwaves across the globe. The stock market went into freefall. Banks didn't trust each other anymore, credit froze, and the world braced itself for impact. For ordinary people, it was terrifying. For some, it was devastating. But for a handful, the ones who had bet on the collapse of that bubble, it was the moment they had been waiting for. This is where our story takes a sharp turn, because the tale of the 2008 crisis isn't just about tragedy. It's about those who read the signs, those who connected the dots, those who dared to stand against the tidal wave of optimism. And it's about those who profited handsomely from the wreckage. Take Michael Burry, for example. A neurologist turned hedge fund manager, Burry had an eye not just for medicine, but for anomalies. He spotted something strange in the mortgage market years before the collapse. Loan structures that didn't make sense, repayment schedules that were doomed to fail, borrowers who could never, ever keep up. While the entire financial world was cheering the housing boom, Burry was the one whispering, "This will end badly." He placed bets, radical bets, against the housing market, and people laughed, until the laughter stopped. Or John Paulson, a man whose name would soon be etched into financial history for orchestrating one of the most profitable trades ever made. While most of Wall Street was scrambling to figure out what had gone wrong, Paulson had already set himself up to win big from the collapse. Billions of dollars flowed into his fund as the world outside crumbled. And then there's Goldman Sachs, that infamous titan of finance. To their clients, they promised safety and growth. Behind the curtain, they were betting the other way, constructing trades that would profit when their own clients' investments fell apart. A betrayal? A masterstroke? Maybe both. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we dive into the faces and names of those who made fortunes, we need to feel the ground shake beneath the feet of those who lost everything. Because only by understanding the pain can we grasp the audacity of the profit. Do you remember the families I mentioned earlier, the ones loading cardboard boxes into moving vans? That's where we go next. To the living rooms where eviction notices landed like grenades, to the suburbs where for sale signs sprouted overnight like weeds, to the towns where factories closed and dreams dissolved. Because in the shadows of their suffering, the winners of 2008 quietly counted their gains. The collapse of 2008 was not an abstract number on a stock ticker. It was not a distant tremor that only shook Wall Street skyscrapers. It was a tidal wave, a mortgage tsunami, and its victims were ordinary families, people who never thought of themselves as gamblers, people who believed they were playing by the rules. Imagine a family in California, or in Nevada, or in Florida, 3 epicenters of the housing bubble. Just a few years earlier, they had walked into a bank office and been greeted with smiles. "Congratulations," the loan officer had said. "You're approved." They hadn't even needed to show much proof of income. Sometimes no proof at all. "Don't worry," the officer would assure them. "Housing prices always go up. Even if things get tough, you can refinance later." This is the American dream. And so they signed. They carried the keys home like trophies, believing they had finally made it. A few years later, the interest rate adjusted. Payments doubled. Jobs became unstable. Suddenly, the dream felt like a trap. Late fees piled up. Threatening letters arrived in the mail. And then one day, the sheriff knocked on the door. It wasn't just one family. It wasn't a few streets. It was entire neighborhoods. Rows of houses stood empty, grass growing wild, windows boarded up. Streets that once echoed with children's laughter became silent. In cities across the country, for sale signs multiplied like weeds. It was as if the American dream had been repossessed. The statistics paint a chilling picture. Between 2007 and 2010, nearly 4 million homes were foreclosed in the United States. Families packed up their lives in cardboard boxes, sometimes in the middle of the night to avoid the humiliation of neighbors watching. Children switched schools again and again, living in motels, in cars, sometimes in shelters. A crisis that had begun as a financial problem on Wall Street had torn through the very heart of ordinary lives. And it wasn't just homeowners. Workers lost their jobs as businesses folded. Entire industries contracted. Construction sites were abandoned mid-project. Truckers had fewer goods to haul. Restaurants closed as families stopped going out. The domino effect of the housing collapse rippled outward, leaving destruction in its wake. Think of Detroit, once the proud symbol of American industry. In the years following the collapse, the city looked like a battlefield. Rows of abandoned houses, factories shuttered, unemployment soaring. The crisis had pulled back the curtain on how fragile the economy really was for millions of people. But here is the cruel irony. As people lined up at unemployment offices, as food banks saw their longest queues in decades, as families lost everything, there were those who were counting profits. For every foreclosure, for every mortgage that defaulted, for every toxic loan that imploded, someone else had bet against it and was cashing in. The suffering of millions was the foundation of fortunes for a select few. But those names, the winners of the crisis, we'll come to them soon. First, we must understand how a handful of individuals and institutions could possibly see what no one else seemed to see. While newspapers screamed panic, while the government scrambled to contain disaster, a few contrarian voices had already been preparing for this moment. And that's where our story flows next. Because while the victims packed up their homes and wondered how their lives had collapsed so suddenly, there were men in quiet offices flipping through spreadsheets, realizing that their boldest, strangest bets were about to pay off. Men who had been dismissed as crazy, paranoid, even self-destructive, were about to become prophets of profit. They were the ones who saw the cracks before the wall came down. They were the ones who dared to question the booming chorus of optimism. They were the ones who didn't just predict the collapse, they turned it into the opportunity of a lifetime. And the first among them was a man with no background in finance at all. A man whose story seems almost impossible. A medical doctor, a neurologist, who saw what the best minds on Wall Street refused to see. His name was Michael Burry. Michael Burry didn't look like the kind of man you'd expect to bring Wall Street to its knees. He wasn't a slick trader in a $1,000 suit, or a Harvard MBA with an army of interns crunching numbers for him. He was, of all things, a neurologist. A doctor who, in his spare time, ran a blog where he dissected stock prices the way a surgeon dissects tissue, precise, detached, clinical. Burry was strange, too, in ways that made him hard to ignore. He had a glass eye from a childhood illness, an awkward manner of speaking, and a habit of working through the night in his office while rock music blared from the speakers. But beneath the quirks, there was something sharper. An obsessive mind. A man who noticed details others skimmed over, who refused to accept surface-level answers. In the early 2000s, while Wall Street was celebrating the unstoppable rise of housing prices, Burry was quietly digging into the fine print of mortgage-backed securities. These were the bundles of home loans that banks packaged together and sold as investments. To most investors, they looked like solid, safe bets. To Burry, they looked like ticking bombs. He read the contracts line by line. He noticed how many loans were being given to people with no stable income, no down payment, sometimes no paperwork at all. He noticed how adjustable-rate mortgages would suddenly balloon into unaffordable payments after just a couple of years. He noticed that entire securities, worth billions, were being built on the weakest possible foundations. And Burry did something almost unthinkable at the time. He bet against the housing market. He went to the big banks and asked to buy something called a credit default swap, essentially insurance that would pay him if those mortgage bonds failed. The bankers laughed. To them, it was like someone asking for insurance in case the sun didn't rise tomorrow. But they were more than happy to sell it to him. After all, if he wanted to throw away money, why not let him? Here's the twist. Burry wasn't alone. A few others, scattered across the financial world, were starting to piece together the same puzzle. Steve Eisman, a blunt, foul-mouthed hedge fund manager, realized that Wall Street itself didn't even understand the products it was selling. He went to meetings with bankers who couldn't explain what was in the securities they were pushing. They don't even know what's inside their own boxes, he once quipped. Then there was Greg Lippmann, a trader at Deutsche Bank, who turned the bet against the housing market into a sales pitch, convincing others to join in. And John Paulson, a relatively unknown fund manager, who would go on to make the single biggest profit in financial history from the collapse. But Burry was the first. He saw it earliest, and he endured years of ridicule, anger from his own investors, even threats of lawsuits. Imagine being the lone voice shouting fire in a crowded theater, while everyone else is dancing. That was Burry in 2005, 2006, 2007, telling anyone who would listen that the entire housing market was a lie, that a crash was coming, and that it would be catastrophic. And then slowly, reality began to catch up with his predictions. Late mortgage payments rose, foreclosures spread, the cracks in the foundation widened. Investors who once mocked him now scrambled to understand what he had seen all along. By 2008, when the crash detonated in full force, Burry's once ridiculed bet had turned into a windfall of hundreds of millions. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the proof that the system had been rotten all along, and that one outsider, looking in from the margins, had read the truth in the numbers. Yet, as the spotlight turned to Burry, another story unfolded, of men like John Paulson, who not only saw the collapse coming, but managed to turn it into one of the most staggering fortunes of all time. And his story shows just how far someone was willing to go, not just to survive the storm, but to build an empire out of its wreckage. And that, friends, is where we head next. John Paulson was not a household name before 2007. He ran a mid-sized hedge fund in New York, respectable but not legendary. He wasn't Michael Burry with his glass eye and obsessive file reading, and he wasn't a Wall Street titan commanding empires. He was, at best, a man with a solid track record, a quiet operator in the background of finance. But by the time the dust settled on the financial crisis of 2008, John Paulson would be infamous. Because while the rest of the world was bleeding, Paulson made one of the biggest fortunes in modern history. How? Let's peel this back. Paulson's genius move wasn't spotting the housing collapse first. Burry had already done that. What Paulson did was take the bet and supersize it, turning it into the single most profitable trade in history. He realized that if you structured the right deals, if you found the weakest mortgage securities and bet against them, you could scale up that idea until the numbers became staggering. But there was a darker side to his play. Unlike Burry, who painstakingly analyzed the toxic loans and sounded like a Cassandra warning of doom, Paulson worked with the very banks that were building these doomed securities. Goldman Sachs, for instance, put together bundles of mortgages, collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs, while Paulson quietly picked out the worst of the worst to bet against. He was, in effect, helping to stack the deck. The securities looked fine on the surface, 8AA ratings stamped by agencies like Moody's, but underneath they were garbage. And Paulson was the man who knew they were garbage, because he had chosen the trash himself. By 2007, Paulson's fund was making money at a speed that seemed unreal. As families lost their homes, as neighborhoods crumbled, as entire banks collapsed, Paulson's accounts filled with billions. In a single year, he personally earned an estimated $4 billion, more than any CEO, more than any banker, more than anyone had ever made in 1 year from a single financial play. And his fund, over the course of the trade, pulled in around $15 billion in profit. To put that in perspective, Paulson, a relatively unknown hedge fund manager, made more in 1 year than most Fortune 500 companies. His name became synonymous with the idea of profiting from collapse. He was hailed as a genius by some, reviled as a vulture by others. And the truth is, both are right. Paulson didn't cause the crash, but he fed on it. He anticipated it, structured his bets to maximize it, and walked away with riches that almost no one else in history could dream of. Yet Paulson's story also reveals a chilling detail: that the very system that collapsed in 2008 wasn't just a mistake or an accident. It was a casino, and some players were allowed to gamble with the dice loaded in their favor. Paulson was simply the best at playing that crooked game. But he wasn't the only one. While Paulson was reaping billions, another kind of figure was rising from the ashes. Not the Wall Street insider, but the government and institutional players who saw opportunity in crisis. Because while some individuals made fortunes, entire institutions were quietly pulling off maneuvers that shifted the balance of power forever. And that takes us directly to the next chapter of our story, the role of Goldman Sachs, the so-called vampire squid wrapped around the face of finance, accused of selling securities to clients while secretly betting against them. The story where the line between banker and bookmaker disappeared altogether. If there was one name that became shorthand for everything rotten about the 2008 crisis, it was Goldman Sachs. People called it the vampire squid, a creature with its tentacles wrapped tight around the financial system, sucking blood from every artery it could find. The phrase came from a Rolling Stone article by journalist Matt Taibbi, and once you've read it, you can't forget the image. A Wall Street Leviathan feeding on collapse, all while pretending to be a trusted advisor. Here's the paradox of Goldman Sachs in 2008. The firm presented itself as a steady hand, a bank helping clients navigate choppy waters. But behind the scenes, Goldman was betting against those same clients. They were selling mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations, pushing them as safe investments, even as the firm was privately shorting those very products. It was like a doctor prescribing medicine while secretly knowing it's poison, and simultaneously buying life insurance on the patient. Let's rewind. Before the crisis peaked, Goldman had been one of the biggest players in the mortgage boom. They packaged subprime loans into securities, got rating agencies to bless them with 8AA ratings, and sold them worldwide to pension funds, governments, and ordinary investors. For a while, the fees rolled in, the profits stacked up, and Goldman was untouchable. But then the cracks began to show, defaults began to spike, and Goldman did something cold-blooded. They flipped their bets. Internal emails later revealed in congressional hearings told the story. Executives wrote about shitty deals they were selling to clients, all while hedging their own exposure. They weren't blind. They knew the house of cards was shaking, and they intended to profit from the collapse. And profit they did. When housing imploded, Goldman didn't just survive, they thrived. By shifting into short positions and cutting risk at the right moment, they avoided the worst losses and walked away with billions. But here's the catch. While Goldman's bets were paying off, their clients, who trusted the bank's advice, were destroyed. Pension funds lost billions. Towns and municipalities were left with toxic debt. Ordinary families bore the brunt of the crash, while Goldman's executives collected record bonuses. When the scandal broke, Goldman claimed they were merely market makers, just matching buyers with sellers, not responsible for what people bought. But the truth was uglier. They knew what they were selling, and they knew it was rotten. In 2010, the SEC even charged Goldman with fraud over one of these deals, the infamous Abacus transaction, where Goldman let hedge fund manager John Paulson, yes, the same Paulson from earlier, handpick doomed mortgages to stuff into a security, then bet against it. Goldman's clients lost over $1 billion. Paulson walked away a billionaire. Goldman paid a fine of $550 million, a slap on the wrist compared to what they had made. But here's the chilling part. Goldman Sachs didn't just profit from the collapse. They positioned themselves to profit from the recovery too. When the U.S. government rolled out the TARP bailout and Federal Reserve liquidity programs, Goldman was among the first in line. Billions in taxpayer support flowed into the financial system, stabilizing banks like Goldman. In short, they bet against the bubble, made billions, got bailed out when things went south, and then kept their grip on power. It's no wonder Goldman became the villain of the story. Not because they were uniquely evil, but because they were the perfect symbol of how the system itself was rigged. They were proof that in the casino of finance, the house always wins. But Goldman was not the only institution to turn crisis into opportunity. While they schemed in the shadows, another giant loomed, one that operated on a scale far greater than any Wall Street bank, the Federal Reserve. And if Goldman was the vampire squid, the Fed was the unseen hand that decided which creatures lived and which went extinct. And so we move to the next chapter. The role of central banks, the quiet architects who didn't just react to the crisis. They reshaped the entire playing field. The Federal Reserve. 3 words that sound dry, technical, almost boring. But in 2008, those 3 words became the difference between survival and extinction, not just for banks, but for entire economies. If Goldman Sachs was the vampire squid of the crisis, then the Fed was the ocean it swam in. Invisible to most, yet decisive in shaping who lived and who drowned. The financial system had collapsed under its own weight. Credit markets froze. Banks stopped lending to each other because no one knew which balance sheet was real and which was toxic. The world's financial plumbing clogged up overnight. And when that happened, the Fed stepped in with tools most people had never heard of, unleashing trillions of dollars into the system. At first, it looked like firefighting. The Fed slashed interest rates to near zero. It opened emergency lending windows for banks teetering on the edge. But this wasn't just a rescue operation. It was a redistribution of power. Because the Fed had to choose which institutions were too big to fail and therefore deserved salvation, and which could be left to collapse. Lehman Brothers? Gone. Bear Stearns? Swallowed by J.P. Morgan with Fed backing. AIG? Rescued with $180 billion of government support, not because anyone cared about AIG's shareholders, but because its collapse would have destroyed the global insurance of financial bets. And through it all, the Fed became the ultimate kingmaker, deciding who got bailed out, who got merged, and who got buried. But there was more. The Fed created programs so vast and so unprecedented that even now, many people don't realize how much money moved in those dark months. Trillions in secret loans to banks around the world, not just in the U.S. The Fed became a lender to Europe, Asia, anyone tied into the global dollar system. The crisis had shown something profound. The Federal Reserve wasn't just America's central bank anymore. It was the world's central bank. And the beneficiaries? The same banks that had fueled the bubble. Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs. They all received lifelines. Taxpayer money and Fed liquidity became the scaffolding that propped up Wall Street's towers, even as Main Street's houses were being boarded up. Critics screamed that this was moral hazard on an epic scale, rewarding the arsonists who had set the fire in the first place. Defenders said there was no choice. Let the system collapse, and everyone would be dragged under. The truth lies somewhere in between. But one fact is undeniable. The crisis didn't weaken Wall Street. In the long run, it made it stronger. Banks emerged even bigger, more concentrated, more entwined with the state than before. And this reshaping wasn't accidental. The Fed's actions, combined with the government bailouts, effectively anointed a small group of financial institutions as the permanent core of the system. Too big to fail became too big to touch. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question. While millions lost jobs and homes, who exactly walked away richer from the policies meant to save us all? The answer isn't just hedge funds or banks. It's also the hallowed world of government contractors, corporate CEOs, and even politicians whose careers were minted in the chaos. Because while the Fed wrote the rules of survival, an entire ecosystem learned how to feed off crisis, and some turned it into their business model. And that's where our story now moves. The shadowy world of hedge funds and opportunists who didn't just survive the crash. They mastered the art of monetizing disaster. If the Fed was the great puppet master of the crisis, hedge funds were the street magicians, slipping cards, bending rules, and pulling fortunes seemingly out of thin air. To most of the world, 2008 looked like a massacre. But for a select few, it was a stage set for their greatest performance. While banks stumbled and governments scrambled, hedge funds thrived on volatility. Remember those guys who had bet against subprime mortgages? They didn't just win. They cashed in at levels so outrageous, their names became part of financial folklore. John Paulson, for instance, wasn't exactly a Wall Street celebrity before the crash. But by shorting mortgage-backed securities, literally betting that ordinary Americans would default on their loans, he pocketed about $15 billion for his fund and $4 billion personally. Let that number sink in. One man making more in a single year than most small countries' GDP. And Paulson wasn't alone. David Tepper, another hedge fund titan, played a different angle. While everyone else saw rubble, Tepper looked at the wreckage of bank stocks and smelled opportunity. His fund, Appaloosa Management, loaded up on beaten-down shares of Citigroup and Bank of America when they were practically radioactive. Most people thought he was insane. But when the Fed's lifelines revived those institutions, their stocks skyrocketed. Tepper's bet turned into billions, cementing his reputation as the man who laughed while the financial world burned. This wasn't just luck. Hedge funds lived for chaos. The very structure of their business, nimble, unregulated, opportunistic, allowed them to go places big banks couldn't. They shorted currencies, exploited distressed debt, and bought up defaulted mortgage bonds for pennies, then resold them when the market thawed. Where others saw ashes, they saw kindling. But let's be clear. This wasn't some neutral, victimless profit. Every dollar made by betting against homeowners represented a family losing its house. Every gain from buying toxic assets at a discount represented someone else's savings obliterated. Hedge funds didn't cause the crash, but they turned the misery into their meal ticket. And they did it with a flair for secrecy. Many of these trades were executed quietly, through obscure derivatives and offshore entities. Even years later, regulators admitted they didn't fully know the scale of what had happened behind the curtain. To the public, it was invisible. To the insiders, it was the biggest wealth transfer of their lifetimes. Yet the hedge funds weren't just predators circling a dying beast. They also played kingmaker roles, providing liquidity when banks wouldn't, taking over assets the government couldn't manage, and in some twisted way, helping stabilize the system. Opportunism and salvation blurred together. Were they villains or reluctant heroes? Depends on whether you lost your job in 2009 or whether you were lucky enough to invest with Paulson before the collapse. And perhaps the darkest irony of all, hedge fund legends like these became idols. They were profiled in glossy magazines, invited to exclusive conferences, turned into icons of smart money. The public outrage that crushed Lehman executives somehow never reached them. They walked away, not only rich, but celebrated. Which brings us to the next piece of this puzzle. Hedge funds were wolves in the open, but in the shadows, a quieter, stranger kind of profiteer was emerging. People who didn't run funds, didn't sit in government, but understood that in every crisis, the scavengers arrive. And 2008 gave rise to a new breed entirely, the vulture capitalists. If hedge funds were wolves circling the chaos, then vulture capitalists were exactly what their name suggests. Predators swooping in after the kill, feeding on the carcass of collapsed companies and debt-ridden nations. And the 2008 financial crisis gave them a banquet. Imagine entire corporations on life support, Lehman's leftovers, bankrupt developers, defaulted mortgage bundles, and somewhere in a quiet boardroom, a man in an expensive suit is sharpening his knife. Vulture funds specialized in buying distressed assets for pennies, then squeezing every last drop of value out of them. The trick was simple, at least on paper. A pension fund collapses. A bank is drowning in bad loans. or a country defaults on its bonds. Enter the vultures, who buy up the debt dirt cheap. Then, instead of forgiving or restructuring it, they demand full repayment, often through years of litigation. They turned misery into leverage, and leverage into gold. Take Paul Singer's Elliott Management, for instance. While the headlines screamed about foreclosures and bailouts, Singer's firm hunted sovereign debt, bonds issued by struggling nations. Argentina became his most famous prize. By scooping up defaulted bonds at a fraction of their value, Elliott dragged the country through courts for over a decade, refusing to settle for anything less than full payment. The profits? Measured in billions. To ordinary Argentinians, this was nothing short of financial blackmail. To Wall Street, it was a brilliant play. And it wasn't just nations. Entire industries, from airlines to automakers, found themselves stripped and refitted by vulture investors. Chrysler, GM suppliers, even small regional banks, all became part of a feeding frenzy. It was the financial version of scavenging. Wait until something collapses, then feast. What makes it chilling is the cold precision. These weren't emotional bets or panicked rescues. Vulture funds thrived on patience and paperwork, scouring contracts for loopholes, hunting for weak governments that couldn't fight back, and weaponizing courts in London and New York to enforce their claims. While public outrage flared against the bankers who caused the crash, vultures stayed in the shadows, quietly collecting their spoils. Critics called them parasites. Supporters called them disciplinarians of global markets. After all, if countries or corporations knew the vultures were out there, maybe they'd think twice before borrowing recklessly. But let's not kid ourselves, discipline wasn't the point. Profit was. Pure, ruthless, and detached from the human cost. And yet, without vultures, many collapsed companies might have vanished entirely. By restructuring debt and forcing bankruptcies through, they sometimes paved the way for recovery. It was a brutal form of triage. Tear the bandage off, sell the parts, let new life grow in the ruins. Cold medicine for a bleeding world. Still, one can't escape the image. A skyline littered with foreclosed homes, millions of jobless workers, and far above, circling quietly, men in suits with contracts instead of claws. But vultures weren't the only predators circling in 2008. Beyond Wall Street, another layer of profiteers emerged, quieter, subtler, but no less significant. Politicians and insiders who understood that with every crisis comes not just risk, but opportunity. And while hedge funds and vultures played with money, these people played with laws, influence, and power itself. If hedge funds and vulture investors were the hunters and scavengers of the 2008 crisis, then politicians and insiders were the architects who quietly rearranged the maze while the rest of us tried to find the exit. And make no mistake, they didn't just survive the storm. Many of them thrived in it. You see, when the markets collapsed, the government rushed in with lifelines, bailouts, stimulus packages, emergency loans. On paper, it was all about saving the system. But behind the closed doors of Washington and London, the real game was figuring out who would be saved and who would be left to sink. And the ones making those decisions? They weren't neutral referees. They were insiders with ties to the very institutions they were supposedly rescuing. Take Henry Paulson, U.S. Treasury Secretary at the time. Just 2 years earlier, he'd been the CEO of Goldman Sachs. When Lehman Brothers collapsed and panic spread, Paulson's treasury rushed to stabilize the system. But the firm that came out looking unusually healthy? Goldman Sachs. It received billions in bailout-related benefits, not directly as a handout, but through the rescue of counterparties like AIG. The official line was that the bailouts were necessary to prevent systemic collapse. The cynical line, Goldman's fingerprints were all over the policy choices that just happened to shield Goldman's balance sheet. And it wasn't just Paulson. The revolving door between Wall Street and Washington spun at hurricane speed. Lawrence Summers, Timothy Geithner, Ben Bernanke. They weren't villains twirling mustaches, but they all belonged to a class that believed the system had to be preserved at any cost. And when they chose who would be preserved, funny enough, it was the same banks and institutions their careers had been tied to for decades. The irony: while ordinary homeowners lost everything, political insiders were framing the narrative. This isn't about fairness. It's about survival. They argued that saving big banks was essential to protect ordinary citizens. But for millions of families, no lifeboat ever came. The government's hand reached out, but only for the giants. Lobbyists played their part too. As Congress debated bailout bills, financial firms spent millions to make sure the rules bent in their favor. Some firms pushed for accounting tweaks that let them paper over losses. Others lobbied to block restrictions on executive pay. The very institutions that had set the fire were suddenly drafting the instructions for how the fire brigade should put it out. Even darker were the whispers of trades made with inside knowledge. Legislators briefed on the looming collapse allegedly shifted their portfolios before the storm hit. Senators sold off stocks. Hedge fund managers who had friends on Capitol Hill adjusted bets days before key announcements. Legally murky, morally repulsive, but in the fog of crisis, few were punished. And here's the most chilling part. Once the crisis settled, those same insiders framed themselves as the heroes. "We saved capitalism," they declared. Books were written, lectures given, institutions praised. But if you look closely, it wasn't capitalism that was saved. It was a small circle of powerful players pulling the levers, ensuring that when the dust cleared, they were still standing tall. By now, you can probably feel the pattern. Hedge funds bet against the house. Vultures fed on the carcasses. Politicians rewrote the rules mid-game. And just when you think the cast of profiteers is complete, another group enters, quieter still, but every bit as influential. These weren't gamblers, scavengers, or lawmakers. They were the giants who control the flow of money itself. The central bankers, and their moves during the crisis would shape not just profits in 2008, but the global economy for decades to come. If the hedge fund titans were the wolves and the political insiders the architects, then the central bankers were the sorcerers. They didn't just play the game, they controlled the board. And in 2008, with the world spiraling into panic, their decisions transformed financial ruin into the greatest wealth transfer of the modern era. Think about this. Money itself is only as stable as the trust behind it. When trust evaporated in the autumn of 2008, markets froze. Credit, the oxygen of modern economies, simply stopped flowing. That's when the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and others stepped in. But here's the thing. The way they stepped in didn't just stabilize the system. It rewrote the rules in favor of the very players who had caused the collapse. The Federal Reserve slashed interest rates to near zero. Then came quantitative easing, a technical term that really just meant printing money and using it to buy financial assets, government bonds, mortgage-backed securities, trillions of dollars worth. To the average person, that policy felt like smoke and mirrors. But to the banks, the hedge funds, the asset managers, it was manna from heaven. Suddenly, toxic securities that nobody would touch had a buyer, the central bank. Who benefited most? Not the foreclosed families, not the unemployed workers. The beneficiaries were the financial institutions whose balance sheets magically improved, and the investors savvy enough to realize that this tidal wave of printed money would send stock markets roaring again. In fact, those who had the capital to buy equities in 2009, after the crash, but before the rebound, ended up riding one of the greatest bull runs in history. Central bankers never bought shares directly, but their policies pushed capital back into markets. The Dow Jones, the S&P 500, global indices, all skyrocketed in the decade that followed. And here lies the cruel irony. The crisis that destroyed middle-class wealth also created a once-in-a-generation chance for the wealthy to multiply theirs. Cheap credit, near-free borrowing costs, asset prices artificially propped up. The rich grew richer. The poor never recovered. By 2018, 10 years after the crash, U.S. billionaires had doubled their net worth. Home ownership among ordinary Americans had dropped to lows not seen in decades. The scars were permanent. Bernanke, Trichet, Draghi, their names won't inspire the same fury as hedge fund managers or political fixers. They wrap their moves in the language of stability, policy, necessity. But if you strip away the jargon, the effect was clear. Power shifted even more decisively toward those who could already afford to play in the high-stakes casino of global finance. And so, as we look back, the question isn't just who got rich off the crisis, it's who had the system redesigned for their survival. Hedge funds thrived because they bet against the house. Vulture investors thrived because they fed on the wreckage. Politicians and insiders thrived because they knew where the rescue lines would be thrown. And central bankers, they made sure the system didn't collapse, but in doing so, they guaranteed that the biggest winners were the very people who had lit the match. So the next time you hear the phrase, "never let a good crisis go to waste," remember 2008. Remember that the collapse wasn't just a disaster. For a select few, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. And here's where I leave you with a thought. If the next great crisis is always around the corner, who's already positioning themselves to win? And more importantly, at whose expense? Friends, if you've stayed with me through this story, you already know history repeats, but the winners usually stay the same. So before you go, hit that like button, subscribe if you want more hidden chapters of our financial past, and tell me in the comments, where were you in 2008, and how did it affect your life? Subscribe to the channel, like, and see you in the next episode.